I'm Steve Aftergood. I work at the Federation of American Scientists, and we're talking about national security secrecy. As Gene mentioned, there's a new decision out this morning. The appellate court rejected the lower court grant of a GLOMAR exemption to the CIA. They told the CIA, you can't claim that all the records, that whether or not you have records related to drones is itself a classified fact. We don't accept that. You haven't justified it. You can't do it. Now, no documents have been released, but the case has been sent back to the lower court for processing. It's a victory for openness. It's a rebuke to the CIA. It's a rebuke to the administration. They took a very hard line. They said, not only can we not release documents, we can't even tell you whether we have documents. And it took an appeals court to say, no, that's not true. That's not acceptable. It reminds me of something that was said yesterday at a Sunshine Week program at the Brennan Center, where Robert Litt, the general counsel at the Office of Director of National Intelligence, was speaking. And one of the things he said was that reasonable people can disagree about the need for classification in any particular instance. The point he was making, I think, is that deciding to classify something is not a strict mathematical process that only has one right answer. It's a judgment, and different people might reach different judgments. But I would amend his statement to say that reasonable people can disagree about classification if they are allowed to. More than that, if reasonable people are allowed to disagree about classification, there will be less secrecy as a result. If you ask the CIA, can you acknowledge the use of drones in targeted killing, they will say, no, it's part of a covert action. We can't discuss it at all. If you tell them, well, go back and think about it again, they're going to say, well, it's still part of a covert action. We can't discuss it at all. But if you bring in somebody else to say, look, this is, we know what's going on here. Why can't you just talk about it? That's what the court did today. They said, yes, you have to acknowledge this. When the circle of people who are allowed to evaluate classification is expanded, the result is that secrecy contracts. We see this year after year in the conduct of the ICECAP, the Interagency Security Classification Appeals Panel. That's a government body that reviews appeals of mandatory declassification review requests that have been denied by an agency. And even though the ICECAP itself is made up of members of executive branch agencies, it overturns the classification decisions of its member agencies more often than not. And I think there's a lesson to be learned from that model that can be applied much more broadly. If we could bring either the ICECAP itself or an ICECAP-like body to bear on current topics of classification controversy, whether it's drones, whether it's Office of Legal Counsel memoranda on targeted killing, whether it's Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court opinions, and give them an assignment to say, look, we want you to declassify as much as you possibly can, I think there's every reason to believe that the result would be a dramatic reduction in the current scope of secrecy. As long as we assign classification decisions only to one party, we don't allow reasonable people to disagree, we're always going to get the maximum level of secrecy. And if there's one thing that we could do to restructure our existing classification program without massive upheaval or investment of new resources, it would be a procedure that would allow controversial classification judgments to be elevated to this kind of multi-party review. And I guess I'd like to leave it at that and hand it over to John Fitzpatrick.
So thanks very much, and my thanks to Patrice and the folks in the Freedom Forum and Newseum for the opportunity to participate today, and it's always a pleasure to engage in this high-level discourse with Steve Aftergood, and I look forward to your participation and questions. As Steve said, my name is John Fitzpatrick. I'm the Director of the Information Security Oversight Office. That is an office that is within the National Archives and Records Administration and serves the purpose within the executive branch to oversee, interpret, and develop policies, the executive branch policies for classified national security information, and to monitor and assess and report on the performance of executive branch agencies in those classification programs. We are the home for the ICECAP, which Steve mentioned. I'm the executive secretary of that. We are also the staff organization that supports the Public Interest Declassification Board. And I'm grateful to Miriam for earlier today giving a shout out to the board and making a note of the board's recent report, a series of recommendations provided to President Obama in November, made public in December, and available on the archives.gov website under the /declassification. So you can learn about the recommendations that were made to transform the national security classification system by going there. I've been the director of ISOO for about a year and a half. I have nearly 29 years as a federal employee. Spent much of that time in the intelligence community, so there's no small irony in the launching this event with the announcement of that case. And I always need, I'm not an attorney, and I always need help understanding when one court overthrows or overturns the decision of another, for whom that is good and for whom that is not. So the plain language interpretation, I take direct from Steve, but I spent 27 of those years at CIA, and I understand the culture. And if I can, I'll say, take a step beyond what Steve mentioned, and amend those comments to say reasonable branches of government can disagree, because I think that's what this example illustrates. My office and the activity of the ICECAP and ISOO and government agencies operate within the rules of the executive branch. And the interaction of the different branches of government is a powerful illustration and a needed influence to help shape where classification, how it affects the programs that our government performs. Often these discussions, and certainly today and certainly in yesterday's discussion, they go to the highest and most extreme or most complicated and attention-getting issues of our government's actions. And the national security is a primary concern. It is true that many of the things that have to do with these national security programs are classified. It is rare that the primary reason for the tension between, I'll say, citizens or the branches of government over the information relative to these programs is first about its classification. The mechanism to get to the information that is desired encounters that barrier. But the fact that it's classified is one attribute. The fact that it is critical to a national security mission is another. The fact that there are political dialogues that are layered in and around the pursuit of information about a drone program or any of the other high-profile activities. So these are very complex things, and it's necessary for the branches to interact in that way. I'm a lifelong Washingtonian, lifelong Redskin fan. We're all enamored of our new quarterback. He wears socks that say, "No pressure, no diamonds." And I think that's actually when Steve explained the ruling, I thought, well, that's what's going on here. And that's important, and it's critical, and we need to be able to respond. With regard to the notion of an ICECAP-like model that could help, I think that the ICECAP itself is more of a negotiator than in most of its deliberations. It certainly has the authority to sort of overturn, but most of its process is about negotiating the release of information that is sought in a way that seeks the balance between national and public interest, national security and public interest, and that's a difficult thing. I'll say last, and then I suppose we should open it for questions. There is no policy barrier to improving declassification. There is no policy barrier to reducing overclassification. There are complex demands made of agencies in their missions to meet the needs of national security, to follow the President's direction to both secure something and classify it to the least extent possible. These are difficult things. By and large, they happen in vast transactions that are not of interest. The ones of interest are lost needles in those haystacks, and it is important to keep the dialogue open in all levels, the public to the government and the branches amongst each other, to figure out the best way to get through and find those needles that are needed. So I think I'll stop there, and I think we have a little bit of time left.
We'll move to questions if we do have those. Let me pose one, if I may, while you're making your way up. In writing generally, in terms of the First Amendment and moving beyond this, just the sphere of FOI requests and certain specifics, there seems to be a perception now, post 9/11, that while there may have been this immediate necessity to classify first and settle later, which actually was a phrase used at the time, because of the old joke, you're not paranoid if they really are after you. Would you say that and this is a question for both, have we returned to a system in which there is more concern beyond the policy statement, a genuine concern in agencies about declassifying and opening up again and moving away from that, perhaps legitimate spasm after 9/11?
I feel like it's necessary to break down the question a little bit, because what I've learned is that the government, even the executive branch, is not monolithic. It is comprised of not only many different agencies, even within individual agencies, different offices have different cultures and different standards and different motivations. And some are doing perfectly decent jobs. I mean, working through FOIA, I get pretty good results out of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. I get consistently terrible results out of the Central Intelligence Agency. And, good results out of the National Reconnaissance Office, terrible results out of the National Security Agency. Why is that? Well, it's just how it is. And so to talk about the government doesn't quite capture the complexity of what's going on. There are other aspects to it. Agencies have resource issues. They have different levels of backlog. They have different patterns and practices of classification. I would say that things are in flux, but I wouldn't say it quite reduces to a pendulum swing. I think there's a lot of dynamism in the system, but it's not a simple. I couldn't reduce it simply to a post 9/11 pendulum swing.
No, my first instinct was the same as Steve's. That there is no the government, and that agency practices, they vary. The experience levels that agencies have with certain aspects of the classification system, whether that is being disciplined at the front end and not overclassifying, or having really good guidance about what should be classified, or having programs that seek to find the significant, historically significant information that is within their mountains and mountains of data. The agency practice and capability varies widely over there. And it would be surprising to note, for example, that an agency that gets so much attention, part of their difficulty in the CIA is the amount of attention they get, the amount of requests that come their way, the volume that come their way, and the very difficulty that there is in having explosions of information since 9/11, and yet the same manual, human eyes on the page to declassify kind of process. This is where the work and the publication of the board's recommendations, the Public Interest Declassification Board recommendations, try to put emphasis on the systemic issues that there are to data growth and the ability to produce, hundreds of millions of pages of documents, and yet to have only a paper-based human review process to get there. So those are inherent challenges in the matter.
Thank you. As it happens, we will have a question from this side as well. So we'll go first here, and then to this side, and then back.
I'm John Judge, and I work with the Coalition on Political Assassinations. This is the 50th anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, 45th for Martin Luther King. And despite executive orders saying that files shouldn't always be classified in more than 25 years, everything should be released, the documents relating to these assassinations are still locked up and seemingly exempt from that executive order. And we have been trying to get them loose. We're working now for introduction of a Martin Luther King Records Act in Congress. And the JFK Assassination Records Act that we promoted has really been the only model for full release of historical records outside of the Nazi War Crimes Records Act, because it allows an independent board to make the decisions instead of the agencies. So FOIA was almost useless for the first 30 to 40 years. Trying to get JFK records loose, we got maybe 20,000 pages. Since the passage of the act, we have over 6 million pages released, but we still don't have everything. And I think that there really needs to be more of this sort of model for any kind of transparency in historical records. But we're hoping that given the 50th coming up this year, that we can get some pressure in Congress and elsewhere to reveal the whole record.
Are you asking for their response to that circumstance?
I would say two quick things. One, I think the JFK Assassination Records Review Board is an extremely interesting model of how independent judgment can be brought to bear on difficult or resistant classification issues. Even though you found that there are some things that were withheld, it was extraordinarily effective in breaking the logjam. The other thing I would say, though, is that these kinds of retail efforts, is not the way to deal with the problem. If we're going to have, a JFK board, a Martin Luther King board, there's no end to it. I mean, that's why even today's decision, which is good news on the FOIA front with respect to CIA, is kind of bittersweet. The idea that it takes years of litigation to get a ruling saying, oh, the lower court ruling was wrong. You still can't have any documents, but maybe you can get a description of the documents which you may or may not be able to get. That's no way to address this. We need a systemic solution, and the piecemeal approach is just going to be swamped. It's already swamped.
Part of our problem is that the records, some of our records that we're looking for, are locked up not by the executive branch but by Congress. So if we don't get Congress to move on them, we can't get them loose.
Okay, hello, I'm Barbara Cochran, and I am here with students from the Missouri School of Journalism who are spending the semester here in Washington working in newsrooms around town and attending events like this where they can learn more about Washington and how things work. And looking around the room, I see that many people here are veterans of these kinds of struggles for open government and more information. And I'd like to ask a broader question of you, which is, what kind of hope can you give to these young people who are embarking on careers in journalism that the situation that we will see progress? Where is the sunshine here?
So I was inclined to say you're optimists simply because you came to Washington and you hope to learn how things work. And then your question went and reinforced that notion because you're looking for hope. And that has great appeal. So I appreciate the question. What I would say is my comments earlier about there being no barriers about these particular things really then sets up the opportunity to examine how can reform happen and what would be required to launch it, right? And I think this is a vital part of that process to begin to create a mandate for change. The Public Interest Declassification Board, in its primary recommendation, seeks to instigate that kind of change within the executive branch, to say to the President, who asked for the recommendations, by the way, here are the recommendations. The first thing you should do is stand up an empowered body within the executive branch, populated by all the right disciplines that are needed to examine this problem, including, the historical community, the technology community, the records management and resource management communities, and including then the national security community that has most of what is desired to be gotten out, and to then drive that change towards some specific outcomes. It is not enough to say things aren't the way we like them. It is not enough to say agencies are not compliant with what we think they should be. Compliance in and of itself is not a business plan. It is not a business case. It will not get you to where somebody says you need to go. So you need that leadership mandate and some clearly described outcomes desired. Reduce overclassification. Expedite declassification. Get better access to formally restricted data. Those are very clearly described things that you could then create a plan to go after. But it first starts, and nothing will happen without that leadership mandate. So we're at that part of the conversation with the White House and the Public Interest Declassification Board's recommendation to say, will you have a serious conversation inside the government about these things?
I would just add that there are limits to the sunshine metaphor. The sun shines even if you spend all day lying in bed. And I think that in some ways a better metaphor is to think of a treadmill attached to a generator attached to an electric light bulb. And if you run, you're going to generate some electricity and some light. And the faster you run, the more light you'll generate. The point is, none of this is going to be handed to you or to any of us. It's something you have to fight over, and fighting over is part of the process. And I think we all need to expect to do that.
We have one last question, and I will hope that you move quickly to your question and move to a new topic.
I understand we want to do effectiveness, and we want to do efficiency, and we want to have the truth through the power. The problem is a lot of people who are not only not invited to participate in the debate, but even if they want to say something or if they want to file a complaint, they are disturbed, including the internet or computer. They will be deprived of. But the problem is, can we put, I think I appreciate all your effort and a lot of civil organization effort, but the problem is, can we really put the effort out front so people can participate, so those interrupted in hacking or people's complaint or work processing should be penalized? And any government officials or programs, whether there is a school lunch for kids, or whether there's a school construction, or whether there's economic development, they are basically divert the resources to benefit you, and all the data collection are false. So can we really put the effort in this area so we can really have open government in a real meaningful sense?
Many of these problems cannot be solved by any of us individually, but if we work together and join with others who have similar interests and concerns, we have a chance of making a dent.
Please join me in thanking our
Thank you.